Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 157th segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. Thank you so much for joining us. We begin our 27th chapter, our 27th hour of study. The second generation church that gave us the Gospels rose up with big minds and hearts because they allowed God's grace to redeem the rejection and shame inflicted on them by Israel and turned it into blessings that lifted them up into resurrection. We go to our next screen. We believers still study Scripture, seeking the grace to see and perceive God's wondrous works. The church, after the destruction of Jerusalem, had the eyes of faith to perceive God's wondrous works. They were always studying Scripture. Thus, their witness transformed the world. And they gave us 4 Gospels, which cut to the heart and proclaimed that Jesus came to redeem our feelings of rejection, abandonment, and shame, and turn them into blessings. They felt lifted up in resurrection by the sacraments and their study in the light of the cross. And so we study and seek grace to transform our world. We go to our next screen. And we look at our charts. We began our course in John in 95, writing about Jesus' life, okay? And then secondly, we went to Paul's epistles, which were the earliest scripture written. And then we had the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. This is so important. What we want to focus on now is the second generation church that includes Mark, Luke, Acts, and Matthew, okay? We go to our next screen. And we read, Mark organized his gospel as one journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. This is so important. Matthew and Luke used Mark's one journey to organize their material. Thus we have the synoptics. They all come from one point of view, the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, which was very similar in many ways, yet allowed profound differences. And we seek those profound differences. And both Gospels added stories of Jesus' wondrous birth as an example. Now, number 3, Mark's Jesus was Isaiah's suffering servant who endured shame, rejection, and abandonment. Mark's Gospel has an axis of influences from Alexandria to Rome. So we go to our next chart and we see what I'm talking about. And we see here a map. And it shows that this is Alexandria, where the J is in Jerusalem. The name is not there, sorry about that. But this is where wealthy Jews from Israel would come and take sort of an express train. This is the wealthy people, because this area was the granary of Rome. It fed Rome, and so they had wonderful communication that went to Rome. Mark's Gospel had the axis, the influence of Alexandria to Rome. Okay, we go on to our next screen. And we read there, remember, Mark left with Barnabas after the council in 49 when Paul refused to go with him, and then traveled with Peter to Rome. We don't know how this happened. There's no record of it, but he did go to Rome. Remember, Mark was the rich young man, so he could afford it. He could pay the cost of Peter's travel, and they would have good quarters when they got to Rome. Peter went to Mark's home, which also served as the church in Jerusalem. It was so wealthy. After his escape from prison in 43 AD. This is in Acts 12:12. Okay? Mark's Gospel is referred to as Peter's Gospel. That's very important. Tradition always saw Mark's Gospel as the expression of Peter. Mark is also the patron saint of Alexandria. That's where we're pretty sure that he was very big influence there in Alexandria. We go on to our next screen. And we see the chart again, and now we want to focus on this time after Mark's Gospel. We see the excommunication here of Johannes ben Zakkai in 85. And we see Luke and Matthew are published along with Acts. But by this time, they are no longer in Israel. He has made life more miserable for all the Christian believers, and so they have migrated to other cities, okay? So we go on to our next chart, and we see Johannes ben Zakkai blamed Israeli believers in Jesus for the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So the city is all destroyed. And he said they assimilated, which means they became like Gentiles. They became one with them. Jewish belief doesn't allow for integration. If you try to integrate, you'll assimilate and lose your identity. Number two, the Romans had given Johannes ben Zakkai internal control over Israel. He legally excommunicated believers from the synagogue life by 85, as we saw in the chart, but he had already been dispossessing them of their property, and Mark lost his property in Jerusalem. Matthew and Luke probably started composing within Israel. Matthew in Nazareth, Sepphoris, and Luke in Caesarea. But as believers were dispossessed, they migrated to Asia Minor. Thus, Luke was published in the Ephesus area and Matthew published in the Antioch area. We go on to our next screen. We look at the chart again and we see Ephesus area where John and Paul wrote is also where Luke wrote. So this was very influential in the writing of the New Testament. And now we see that we want to go back to northern Israel, Galilee, where Matthew's gospel began to be written, and he goes up to Antioch, which is right across the bay from Asia Minor, and it begins in Syria. This is going to be important for us later on. We go on to our next screen. Luke presents Jesus as a rural pastoral priest. We emphasize that many times. In Acts, Luke reminds us of the shame and rejection experienced by the Levites deported as slaves. This helped Levite believers later on to lead the church out of Israel's small world into the blessings of a bigger world. The Levitical experience helped believers to see migration from Israel as a blessing, not a curse, that freed them to live by faith and claim the inheritance as children of the covenant of promise made to Abraham, who was also an immigrant. We go on to our next screen. Then we review Matthew as the testimony of believing Pharisees who were Judeans. Remember, we've been emphasizing in Luke how important it is to be a Levite in the Levitical tradition, and the priests were from the Levitical tradition. Matthew's gospel emphasized Jesus as the Messiah who fulfills the law and the prophets. More important, Jesus was the heir to the throne of David and the tribe of Judah. Matthew's gospel was begun in Galilee in the Sepphoris Nazareth area, but then Matthew moved to the Antioch area, and we're going to see how this is important later on. We go on to our next screen. We have a map here. You've seen this before. This is where Matthew began his gospel. He left from Ptolemy and he went up to Antioch, and we see Caesarea down here, right near Samaria, from which Luke left and migrated over to Asia Minor. We go on to our next screen, and we see again the picture of this chart. I hope you're getting it. This is Rome to Jerusalem, or Alexandria is Mark. We see this is the area Caesarea to Ephesus, where Luke went, and this is the area from which Matthew went to Antioch. We go on to our next screen. Jewish believers in Jesus were rejected and abandoned in shame, as was Jesus. But they experienced God's grace redeeming these accursed feelings into blessings. This was the good news they proclaimed to the bigger world, and they won over the bigger world. We go on to our next screen and we read our theme. The second generation church that gave us the Gospels rose up with big minds and big hearts because they allowed God's grace to redeem the rejection and shame inflicted on them by Israel into blessings that lifted them up into resurrection. Thank you so much for joining us for this 157th segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross.
That earth's despair may cease.